So what happens for ice dam? You get, the main thing is leaks inside. That's what obviously bothers people the most. They're in their house and water's dripping in, and unfortunately, when that happens, as long as the weather conditions stay the way they are, at that point, it's going to keep happening because there's very little you can do to affect any repairs at that point. The snow and ice have to melt before you can get up there and do anything to the roof. Again, in an isolated circumstance, you might be able to get somebody to clear the ice dams in that particular location, but it's a temporary solution as long as the weather conditions remain favorable for ice damming. And then, of course, you can get shingle damage from the effect of the ice on the shingles. And here's some, on the left is a pretty extreme example, and then some missing and loose shingles on the right there. And obviously, as I said, the most severe problem, or the most aggravating problem, is the water penetration into the building. And again, as I said earlier, this results from ice dams at the eaves that block the runoff, and then the water backs up, goes under the shingles, and can penetrate inside. Here's some more, excuse me, some more interior damage to the roof sheathing, and then the ceiling in a living space. And as I said, these problems will persist until you can get rid of the ice and snow. So the process of what causes ice damage? Well, there's a process that develops which leads to ice dams building up. Number one is you got to have snow. If you just have cold, obviously it doesn't matter. And you have to have temperatures that are below freezing, at least for most of the time. If they get above freezing slightly during the day, it helps to mitigate the problem a little. But if you have temperatures that are at freezing most of the day and at night, you're going to have the conditions that will allow ice dams to form. So, as I said earlier, the warm air melts the snow up at the ridge. The water flows under the snow blanket, refreezes at the eaves, and builds up ice, and the water backs up onto under the shingles and the roof deck. Here's another diagram about the process. Now, a couple things. Even heavily insulated attics, which will help keep the warm air to a minimum. Things like bathroom exhaust fans that vent into the attic space, dryer exhaust fans that vent into the attic space, or dryer exhaust vents, I should say. Recessed lights that are open into the attic space. All of those are heat sources that allow heat into the attic, even though there might be a heavy blanket of insulation. And also inadequate ventilation of the attic space will then minimize the amount of cool air or cold air that's being drawn in, and allow the warm air to cause problems. So even, as I said, even though you might have insulated heavily, you have to take care of these other areas as well to prevent the heat loss. It's also very difficult to prevent that totally, and so you can still have ice dams forming even with a lot of attention paid to that, but you tend to minimize it if you pay attention to the ventilation and insulation. So again, the snow buildup on the roof, it could be a problem with as little as 1 to 2 inches of snow. It doesn't have to be a deep blanket of snow like is shown here. And you can also see here, that's an ice dam right there at that edge of that roof. Down here it hasn't really started yet. But with that situation and the right temperatures, you'll get ice dams. And again, this is more of what causes it, sub-freezing temperatures. Now, aggravating factors, as I was mentioning, inadequate attic ventilation and improper insulation and poor construction techniques. The minimum required ventilation under the building code is not enough ventilation to prevent ice dams or to minimize ice dams. That's the minimum amount. And again, as I said earlier, if this was a recurring problem every winter here, then it would be economically feasible to take some of these measures by adding a lot of extra ventilation and doing some of these other things. But because it's kind of a sporadic problem, it's not addressed in that way in this part of the country. As far as for the purposes of ice damming and minimizing ice damming, you can't ever have too much ventilation. The ideal situation would be to have an attic space whose temperature is the same as the outside, and you would get no snow melt and therefore no ice dams. That's not really, well, it is achievable, but it's not easily achievable. The idea is to minimize what you do have and then take some other steps to prevent the water from penetrating into the interior. And I'll talk about that. The other thing with ventilation, it's got to be looked at in conjunction with insulation, which I'll talk about here. And typically there's not enough insulation to prevent warm air from causing the problem, the symptoms of ice damming. And even if you have a lot, as I was saying earlier, there's you have voids in the insulation. We go into attics all the time where cable guys, telephone guys take the insulation out and then they never put it back. It's just laying over here on top of other insulation, but there's a big hole in the insulation there, and nobody would know that. You're not going to go, typically people don't go up in their attic and check after the cable guy's been there or the phone guy's been there. So things like that cause issues. Uninsulated penetrations such as dryer vents, flue vents, very typical for insulation to block the soffit vents. They just shove the insulation in without a baffle or anything to allow airflow through there. And so, those are all, recessed lights also, they throw a lot of heat into the attic if, they're not insulated properly. So all of those things will add to the heat build up inside the attic and allow the situation to occur. It's sort of the same thing. The soffits are usually blocked. The insulation's careless in place, leaving voids and everything.